Oh, hello there, and welcome back to Phil Talking D20. So today's session is a continuation of the DM 101 series, which has been on long hiatus as I've been kind of musing about how to structure it. Because it's a complicated topic, but it isn't, but it is. So there you go, that's why. And it's kind of getting a structure that's going to be useful as opposed to kind of not being useful, which is not what this channel is supposed to be about. So I want to start with kind of video 2 being a talking point on how to prep your first session as a new GM, because the first session I talked about was inspiration. I'm going to assume that you've read stuff, you've got excited about something, you've got a bug for something, and that's giving you inspiration. It's giving you and your imagination the kind of the melting pot to work with, because that's really important. You have to have a bit of a kind of a buzz about it, because that's going to help you do everything else. So for this instance, we're going to focus on how you kind of prep the simple first session. And simple's the key word. Your first session that you've ever run is a daunting one, because you're the person sat and everyone else is to an extent relying on you. It's like being a goalkeeper in football. You'll be the one that gets blamed because you're the one that ultimately let the goals in and caused the team to lose. And that's quite a good analogy. There's a lot of pressure, but I think it's artificial in an extent, because the main focus should be on everyone having a fun time, and that includes you as the GM. So, relax. As long as everyone knows that you're a new GM and everyone knows that it's a new session 1 and it's about finding feet, and hopefully the players are in the same boat, although if they're not, that can be useful if they're helpful and productive players that kind of are willing to offer a bit of advice if it's asked for. Don't tolerate being told as the DM what you should do if you feel that doesn't fit with the story you want to tell. The flip of that being, be reasonable. Don't expect the level 1 party to want to fight a Baylor. They will lose horribly. So be reasonable and expect others to be reasonable, and that's fair. And you can't ask for more than that. So going through this process of what you need for session 1, think small, don't think big. Your plan as the new GM is to survive session 1. That's all you want to aim for, surviving session 1 and having a positive experience. Prepping for that is actually a lot simpler than you might think. Go through a very simple process of what is my inspiration. We're going to talk about Pathfinder 2 for this case. What are my party, and what's a nice simple little starting adventure that kicks everything off? So for this example, I'm going to assume that we have this party of 4 people, and it's going to be very classic. It's going to be a fighter, it's going to be a rogue, it's going to be a cleric, and it's going to be a ranger. And the reason why I'm starting with the players as a focal point is they are very easy places to start with what kind of things you might want to happen in your first session. So don't think that you have to completely independently create something. The party have already given you tools for things that can be helpful for you in session 1. So this imaginary 4-player party, being the fighter, the cleric, the rogue, and the ranger, give us some useful things that we can use in the structure of our first session. So we're probably going to start around a settlement. It always makes sense to have somewhere as a starting point, and a settlement is a really obvious go-to location because there are things happening there, and there are places, and there are people, and there are events that could be taking place. So we're going to start small. We're going to say, okay, we've got a starting village, Roxford. It doesn't really matter, but this is the kind of the template structure, if you like. So we're going with a small village, and we have this little party, and they all have some useful skills and talents. So we know we can get away with some combat because we've got a fighter. We know we can get away with some traps and maybe a need for some sneaking because we've got a rogue. We know we've got some healing in the party because we've got a cleric, so we can create an opportunity for those. And the ranger, also combat-y, but also survival, navigation in the wild, knowledge of animals, that kind of a thing, gives us some very useful tools that we can deploy in our session. Examples are as follows. You can have a location outside of town that the party need to navigate to. You get to ask the ranger to make a survival check. The ranger is engaging in the session. Their character is doing something that their character can do. It's an opportunity for them to shine. There can be a random encounter on that journey that puts them in a combat. Maybe there's bandits or, some, wild animals that attack them. There's opportunities for all of them to explore combat and the cleric to use his healing at the end of that combat. You can see how the planning of a session already starts to happen when you're thinking about what can my players do and how can I create things that make them engaged and valued and useful, not only to the story, but the party and to the player themselves as a point of personal reward, which again is something to kind of keep in mind. So our small little village has a nearby small mine. These are arbitrary decisions. And like I said, you don't have to be thinking Lord of the Rings-esque, huge plot, huge world history, huge events. You can build to that. But your session one just wants to be the classic D&D joke. And many RPG games have followed this same kind of vein, is there's rats, giant rats, putting a pub or a shop in peril, and you have to go into the basement and fight the giant rats. It's a kind of rite of passage, kind of in-game joke. But it serves a very important purpose because it's a low-threat encounter with very high degrees of probable success for the party, and it's a way of them getting into facing minor peril in a place of abundant safety. Because if they get into difficulties because just amusing random dice roll shenanigans happen, and suddenly you've got like two party members like mortally wounded because they just all roll terribly for ages and your rats eventually got the better of them by happen chance, they can just immediately withdraw from this simple little basement, the world's smallest dungeon, back into a town where there's probably a cleric in the nearby temple who can immediately provide aid and healing. Or it may be that the shopkeeper has a potion of, cure light wounds on standby just in case, because he knows he has a dangerous rat problem and he's been badly bitten a few times and so has kept a couple in stock. You can see how you can very safely pull them back to something, where they can re-get their footing and re-engage if they absolutely had to. So that kind of a structure for the start of your campaign, your first session, more importantly, is a very valid one. You don't want to suddenly kind of thrust them into a world where they're fighting, level 6 challenge rating ogres. And if you do, you're going to have to be very confident in the narrative elements that you've created to justify how they're going to escape or survive that mechanical encounter that they pretty much can't win. So learn the rules for challenge ratings and how to build encounters and use those to structure your encounters. So for this instance, a very, very simple starting point is there's a small village and you want a couple of events and locations and a couple of thoughts on who's in the village, who are the movers and shakers. Obvious go-to is there's probably some kind of mayor or village elder, depending on how you've got a structure to your world. If you're using off-the-shelf world fluff for places like D&D and Pathfinder, you've already had the inspiration and got an idea of what these kind of entities in the world are, but obviously something like a mayor or a village elder is a classic. So you've got someone like that. So who are they? Scribble a name down, jot a couple of notes down about their personality. Are they cowardly? Are they bolshy? Are they perhaps an unusual race for the town? Something along those lines. Is it an elf that runs this human village, or is it a dwarven family that kind of preside over this kind of hippie wood elf commune. You've got the free reign to be creative at this point, so enjoy it and be a bit creative. Just because we're starting small doesn't mean that it has to be completely and utterly muted down to a beige, bland mess. You can still throw in these little creative kind of sparks. You just don't have to worry about huge, overarching, big picture stuff because we're starting small. So we've got this little village. We've got a couple of movers and shakers. We've got a mayor. There'll be a pub owner. There'll probably be a blacksmith. Kind of think about where they might go. And this is kind of be prepared to be unprepared, because this is also one of the, I suppose, the concerns that a lot of new GMs have. It's how do I cope with the unknown? And if they decide to do something really random, you're not allowed to really stop them. You shouldn't be kind of going, no, you can't do that. But again, there's only so much they're going to want to do because they're level 1 and they've got a starting location, and it's very unlikely they're suddenly going to go, we're going to buy carriage fare to a completely different continent and go 2,000 miles away from where you've started us. It's probably not going to happen. But they are going to want to go off and do different things. The Fighters Guild might want to see if there's the fighter might want to see if there's a Fighters Guild. The cleric will possibly want to visit the temple. Think about those kind of tie-in points. The rogue might want to see if there's a Rogues Guild, or may have even already asked if they're a member of a Rogues Guild or could join one. So you've got these kind of pigeonholes of what the characters have talked about and what their characters are that are also going to help inform you about what you might need to be prepared for. So have a few names, jot a few ideas down. Is there a Fighters Guild? Yes. Who runs it? Why is it cool? 2-3 sentences tops. Don't blow a gasket about it. Don't write an entire history of the Fighters Guild. Obviously, if you want to, start. But don't think you need it to be complete for session 1. Because they're not going to ask 1,000 questions at each location. And if they are, you're in for a rough ride. Basically, is as much as I can help as I can give you on that, and you're just going to have to keep trying to create stuff to fulfill that need if they have that need. And don't be afraid to do it on the fly and jot some notes down afterwards. That's perfectly fine. You don't need it all at sat down session 1. If you've got an environment nearby or that you're thinking about having them visit that might entail specific rules, this is another point. Prepare for those rules. A really good, simple example of this is water. Now, like 99% of the time, you're walking around on the ground and it's normal gravity and everything's perfectly as it is in the real world, up until including water, where there's peril, because if you fail swim checks, you can drown. And you're going to want to have a handle on those rules if that's an environment that they might find themselves in. If they're not going to find themselves in a situation where there are specific rules, don't worry about those rules. In fact, completely ignore them up until a point where you know you're probably going to need them in a session. And this is one of those things about not over-preparing. Are you going to have a fight in your session? You probably want at least 1 or 2 so that it's exciting and there's a bit of peril and there's a bit of danger. But again, don't feel the need to. If you don't want combat in session 1, don't have it in session 1. And if you don't have combat in session 1, only loosely read up on combat, although combat is normally very simple, and with all D20 systems, they're universal. 5th edition D20, always uses this 1 die roll. They'll have some kind of attack value that'll be versus an armor value. If it equals or beats, they get to do damage. Very straightforward. Crits and all those other kind of things, you can get a very quick handle on, and that's done, and you've got a solid idea for it. But again, don't panic about having to know every single facet of combat, because low-level combats tend to be quicker, because everything has fewer hit points, which is always a bonus. So it's never going to be around too long for you to have to really bog down into high-level complicated spells or complex kind of, attack feat combinations, because no one's going to have them because they're all at low level. So you've kind of already got a bit of a saving grace. Like I said, with water, If there's going to be a situation where they visit an area that has water, have an understanding of how the swim rules work. But if they don't. If they're going to be, with the example of the ranger, if you want to get a situation where they might have to travel a short distance, maybe there's a need to visit a nearby town, or maybe they want to go and explore a nearby dungeon that you have hinted at in your kind of session kind of playthrough, it's a great opportunity for a ranger to make a survival check. So just have a bit of an idea about how the survival skill might work, because it's a kind of a classic trope of the ranger class. Intimidate. If the fighter is clearly someone who's gearing up to be a kind of hard man, kind of, hand in the chest, kind of, hands-on, kind of handsy fighter that's not afraid to be provocative, make sure you've got an idea of the intimidate rules as a skill, because if that's something that they've kind of talked about, it's something you can put into your prep. So when they say, I want to make an intimidate to see if I can, push this merchant for a bit more discount, you have an idea of how it works. You don't have to remember it verbatim, but at least having a handle on it makes it easier to kind of deal with at the point where it comes up. And again, if it comes up, because this is that thing, you just can't know what is 100% going to happen. You can only have a very loose idea about obvious possibles. The rogue might want to pickpocket someone. They might want to pick a lock because they're a rogue, and those are intrinsic strengths of the class. If they're playing a different kind of rogue, because there are obviously, certainly in Pathfinder 2, that you have these optional builds, pay attention to their builds for all their classes so that you can have an idea about what key things that they seem to be keen to kind of use or do to help you enable those quicker at the table, which is better for everybody. Now, if they already know and you can rely on them, even better. Very quick, brief read, survival skill. All right, I think I know how it works. And then when the player goes, I'm going to do this, and this is it, and blah, 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 and it sounds about right, let it fly. It's probably fine. At the end of the session, double check, make sure you're confident, move on. Easy peasy. So you can already kind of go through this step process of being able to be more prepared than you thought because of the players and what they're doing and what they're saying and what they've created. And you can then use that as a framework to build your adventure. Like I said, putting in a nearby mine that has become overrun by spiders, and a member of the town requests aid to go and deal with it, immediately presents you with a very classic opportunity for the whole party to use their skill assets to leave the village, make survival checks to get there, maybe have a random encounter, clear the mine using the kind of the rogues kind of knowledge of kind of underground kind of exploration that's often baked into the rogue, and sometimes the fighter as well, with knowledge dungeoneering is a classic example of that. The ranger being able to make nature checks about the spiders, the cleric being able to heal them to keep them sustained and going. Again, in the town, the cleric here is a good example of what you can do. Offer the cleric the opportunity to heal an NPC. He goes to visit the temple to have a chat and get a feel for his character and what's going on, and the temple is an obvious kind of anchor point for a cleric, especially if it's a temple of their god. Very easy bolt in. What's your character's god? Brilliant. Starting village. I'm starting location. I'm putting something relating to that in the world, just like you could put in a fighter's guild for the fighter, or a woodsman guild for the ranger, or whatever you want to do, so that they have these little anchor points that they can gravitate towards if they wish, that make them feel more connected to the world they're in. And they're not complicated. These aren't complicated steps. They're just nice frameworks that access for our players and our world to kind of bring them together. And then a good example of making the cleric kind of feel valued, in the village or the starting location, is present them with someone that's poorly that they can treat using either the heal skill, for example, or using one of their healing spells to kind of resolve. And a good way to key together these stepping stones, have a wounded miner reporting the problem about the spiders in the mine. And then the cleric is someone that kind of brings back information and quest opportunities to a party. These kind of stepping stone processes enable you to use the player base that you've got as stepping stones for stringing together potential plot that they might engage with and be interested with. And it's simple. We're just going with the simple premise of this location is in peril and needs to be dealt with for the benefit of the town. It's not life or death. Well, there is an element of life or death, but there's also the prosperity of the village, and people could kind of, when they come back, be like, oh, you've saved the mine, you've saved the economy of the town. Think about how these processes roll on. And that, again, is a simple process. Good things echo and bad things echo into your world. So if they don't clear the mine, the economy doesn't immediately collapse. But if they then ignore it and it's kind of picked at and poked at and you kind of keep it going, and they never deal with it, and you roll maybe a couple of random dice rolls to see if maybe other people go off and deal with it and it's not dealt with, you can start dropping in narrative hints that that's maybe having an impact now. Maybe the blacksmith is going to go out of business because he's not getting the ore he needs. And so maybe he can come back to them and say, oh, look, we've sent some other people and they haven't come back. Please, will you deal with it? These kind of things that can move forward into session 2. And this rolls back to surviving session 1. You just have to survive session 1 because there'll be lots of things that happen during the session, some of which we had an idea about, such as they go talk to a blacksmith, they visit a temple, they talk to the mayor, they go and drink in a pub and have a chat with a barman or a bar patron, to kind of get a feel for where they are in the world and establish themselves in it. And then the things that come up during the session will help you plan session 2. So you want to try and work from session to session, and slowly, as you build up more information and more events take place and they make decisions and engage with things, you can start to see where things can kind of connect if they need to, where things can kind of lead on to something new or something bigger if it needs be. The obvious example being, if they go into the mine and they start to get really curious as to why there's suddenly been this kind of infestation of spiders, and for whatever reason they become kind of fixated on something and they start going, maybe it's a plot, and you start to hear these kind of conversations, don't be afraid to go, oh yeah, definitely it's a plot. Because if they're keen and excited about it, just run with it. And if that then escalates and becomes a kind of a, we're going to find out who put the spiders in the mine, or we're going to find out what made the spiders go in the mine or come from somewhere else to get into the mine, then just let them keep picking at that rabbit hole and just think about where it goes. And then you've got this, you've gone from having I've got session 1 and I've got a couple of encounters and some ideas about where they might want to go and where they might want to be, to they seem to want to go here, so I'll create here. And you don't have to constantly be thinking, I don't know, what should I create? I'll create this. Oh, they weren't interested. I'll create that. Oh, they weren't interested. I've created all of this over here and they've chosen to go over here. And that's often something that presents kind of or what if they go left instead of right? It doesn't matter, because they don't know what's left or what's right unless you've specifically, as the DM, told them. If you simply say they arrive at a crossroads on a woodland path, which way do you go? Because they are unsure, and they go, oh, are there any tracks to follow? And they make a good survival check, and you go, yeah, there's tracks going right. And then they say, oh, what kind of tracks are they? And you go, oh, animal tracks. And they keep poking at it until you kind of have to give them specifics, and they then choose to go right. Doesn't mean that they're going to go, to a place that you hadn't decided they were going to. It just means that they're going in that direction. And if you've specifically said you want to go to a sacred woodland grove, and they've gone, oh, well, animal track's going this way, that means it's probably taking us to the animal grove. Fair enough. That's where it goes. If they go, oh, maybe these are going to, somewhere else that sounds vaguely credible and sensible, and you kind of go, oh, yeah, that could be quite cool. Have it go there and just make it up on the fly. Don't be afraid to make stuff up on the fly, especially if it's something that the party seem to be kind of excited about. And that presents problems for you as a GM, because you're going to have to kind of fast compute what that will entail. But again, if you've had to think about some structure and some encounters, for example, we've already looked at maybe putting some spiders in a mine. So we've got a handful of these kind of little simple kind of engagements. And you've maybe thought, oh, maybe there's a goblin tribe nearby. Bob's your uncle. Throw one of them in the mix. Don't assume they have to be one or t'other. You can just grab something that you've prepped for somewhere else that they haven't got to yet and maybe don't even know about yet, and just slap it in the direction they're going as something you can use because you have prepped it, and you can make it work from a narrative perspective afterwards. Basically, and that's not retconning, so after the session, but just putting it in play. A good example being they follow the animal tracks. Okay, turns out the animal tracks were goblins riding on deer, for example. If you specifically said deer tracks because you were flustered when you couldn't think what the animal tracks were because they'd asked and you weren't prepared. Bizarre, strange encounter, you suddenly find this little kind of clearing where there's this little kind of campsite. They could hear it as they're approaching with some perception checks. They can hear goblin chattering and maybe a crackling fire. And there are some goblins that have set up a little camp, and their deer are grazing nearby. What happens then? Who knows? What if they immediately go into combat? Then it's a combat. What if they don't? And they suddenly befriend these goblins because they go through these steps of being like, oh, why are they riding deer? Maybe these goblins are different from other goblins because goblins normally aren't kind of at one with nature. They're quite destructive. And these ones seem to be riding deer. So maybe there's something more to this because they're going to give you stuff like that. So don't automatically assume that every encounter will be a combat, and be open to opportunities for things to go in a random direction. And for your party to have suddenly befriended this random kind of pack of deer riding goblins that you hadn't really thought about at the time, other than I might put some goblins in as a classic kind of low level kind of fight encounter, and you had them as stat blocks and you thought maybe this is going to be a fight, and then they went, maybe it isn't, and you went, what? Because that is GMing. But as long as you can kind of just keep that pace of deciding that you are in control and making sure that you're not just arbitrating things as you see them, but you're just going, oh, they've done that, or they've thought about that, and throwing that into the mix and just seeing what happens. Because like I said, session by session, planning from session to session starts you off and gives you information that you can use to build with. You don't have to plan 20 sessions. You just have to think about what might happen in one session. And because you're the GM, you can put some structures in that give you a framework of highly probables as opposed to nothing and no idea. Use the characters, have a think about some settings and some opportunities that are beneficial to the kind of the things that the players have available to them as classes. And if they've given you a lot of talk about things that they're excited about their characters, pick out some of those key points, create some events around those class features or points of kind of excitement for your players, create some NPCs around a very simple, loose structure of what they're probably going to encounter, and you've got a starting bedrock for a session, and then see what they get interested in and where they go, and then use that same process to build session 2. And what happens at the end of session 2? More stuff that you weren't expecting, plus some of the stuff you were, progress those things steadily forward. And if they build a campaign, they build a campaign. If they don't, and they are happy having these series of little mini adventures and kind of detours and almost side quests in a way, happy days. Doesn't need to be anything more than that. But if it starts to present an obvious narrative that you can kind of go, oh, I can tell a slightly bigger story. Maybe the spiders were sent by external forces. Maybe this kind of group of deer riding goblins that we've randomly befriended that we thought was going to be a combat are actually like a nature police that are, you know, trying to kind of figure out who is also causing these kind of issues with, you know, settlements being put under threat by kind of strange creatures. And it just keeps progressing forward. But you're only ever working session to session. Think small. Small isn't uncreative. Small isn't unimaginative. And small isn't simple and dumbed down. Small is smart. Because if you're focusing on small things, you're making something bigger by piecing small things together. Bingo. There you are. Session 1 as a platform has a structure. Being prepared to be unprepared. Knowing the rules you're going to need and not worrying about the rules you won't need. And then using your players, their classes, things that they talked about, perhaps as background or things that they're excited about, as anchor points for events and opportunities in your first session and your starting location. And a settlement is a great choice of some kind. It could be an elven tent city. It could be a dwarven stronghold. It could be a human farming community on the edge of an empire in a kind of, you know, blustery and wild kind of, you know, part of the world. It could be, you know, like an orc camp. It could be like a warren city of kind of gnolls and kind of, you know, hobgoblins. You can justify it because you're the GM. And if you start them somewhere and you give it some flavour, some of those examples sounded like places you shouldn't be allowed to start. If you were to kind of come at it from a traditional old school D&D, oh, well, hobgoblins and gnolls are always evil. And if you were a good party or a, you know, a normal party of adventurers, you would have to fight them all. Why? Have a reason why you don't. These particular gnolls and hobgoblins have signed a peace treaty in this part of the world, and they're just slightly rough and ready, slightly more troublesome, but fundamentally, they're not just going to turn on the party and kill them all straight away. Jobs. That's why. Thanks. Don't be afraid to make those kind of decisions, because although I'm saying we're starting small, we're not thinking dumbed down simplicity. We're thinking solid structure and seeing what plays out. And that is fundamentally the easiest way to ease yourself in to that process of structure and understanding and not getting kind of suckered into, I have to create a million things and know a million things right at the get-go. A good example of this is conditions. Are they going to come up against anything that could afflict them with a condition? Yes, no. Probably in session 1, not. Unless maybe they get to the mine and the spider has a venom that perhaps makes them fatigued. At which point, make a note of knowing what the monsters can do and then drop in the thing that's relevant to that from a condition and save perspective. More rules to learn, but we're learning the specific ones we need. We're not trying to learn everything. So, small steps, big progress. And that is the end of the video. Drop me a like, drop me a sub. Hope you found this useful. Stay tuned, and I will see you on the next video. Peace out.